So our next presenter is, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Smriti Parsheera, and he's a fellow with the CyberBRICSProject and a PhD candidate at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. So go ahead, Smriti, are you with us?
Smriti, yep, that's me. Yeah, hi,
Perfect.
Caroline. Thanks so much. And thank you all for, organizing this rich discussion and for inviting me to share the Indian perspective. Just give me a moment. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I hope you can all see my screen. So
yes.
Basically over the next, thanks. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I thought I'll walk you through some of the big issues around, the social and structural issues around AI governance in the Indian context. And then I wanted to illustrate some of those issues with one, research study that we did last year and the kind of ethical dilemmas that we faced, while doing that. And I'd love to hear from the group, maybe in the breakout session, etc., on how, those issues might have been targeted or addressed better. So with that, I thought I'll just start with a bit of context setting. So, like China and Brazil that we just heard from before, India is a very large digital market. It's also a market that is largely open in terms of allowing foreign investments, in terms of so far allowing, cross-border flows quite freely, although it seems like that is set to change in terms of policy agendas. So that's, one defining feature of the market that we're talking about, a population of 1.3 billion people. It's also a market that's known for its IT services and its IT talent. And with those two factors coming together, we have seen in the last couple of years very strong AI ambitions playing out. So both from the end of the government as well as from the end of the private sector, the startup ecosystem that's thriving in India, there is a strong AI ambition, and therefore the AI conversation is largely driven around promotion of AI, around evangelism of AI. And although there is talk about responsible AI, we so far don't have frameworks of making that binding in any way, either through laws or, in any way that's enforceable. Although, as if we have time, I'll talk towards the end about some of the proposals and some of the principles that have come about over the last few years. And finally, because of all of these factors and, the size and the relevance of the market, India has also managed to find a seat on a lot of global conversations, such as becoming one of the founding members of the Global Partnership on AI. But in line with the themes that we've heard about, including from the keynote speaker, there is an issue around the participation in these forums. So even though, say, India is a founding partner there, it is not someone who played a role in setting of those principles, because the principles originated from, say, the G7 countries, percolated to the OECD, and therefore became the principles also for the Global Partnership on AI. And that does raise bigger picture issues for all developing countries around, some of these principles and how they've come about. So with that, let me jump into some of the structural and social factors that I wanted to talk about. And, I started in the introduction, and you will hear whenever you think about India and AI a lot about, the relevance and the size of the market and how much data it throws up. But I think it is important to highlight that there are certain limitations about the quality of a lot of the data that is out there in existence, as well as the representativeness of that data, right? So if you think about the diversity of the Indian society and then try to correlate that with the kind of information that's out there, there are two issues that pop up. So one is the fact that despite the fact that a lot of the Indian population has come online in the last few years, we still have a pretty wide digital divide. And that translates in the data context to the fact that a lot of the data and information which is out there, commercial data, behavioral data, preferences of consumers, it is data about a particular population group and represents certain demographic groups. So it is erroneous to kind of, extrapolate that to being data about Indians in general or about consumers and humans more broadly. So there is that context of where this data is coming from. And equally, there is this question of overrepresentation of certain groups in certain kinds of data. So I want to give an example of prisons data from India. So if you look at the data from the people who are under trial in prisons in India, a lot of them, a disproportionate majority, happen to be persons who are from marginalized class, from a marginalized caste, from marginalized religions. And that is for a number of historical and structural factors. But if we were to use that data for any kind of predictive policing, any kind of analysis and AI based on that, that will as you can imagine, of course, lead to structurally flawed outcomes. So those were two limitations I wanted to highlight on the kind of data that is available. Also, the global data sets that do exist today, a lot of them, if you try to do applied research which is relevant to the Indian context, you will find that you find Indian data or in data about Indians to be a very small subset, and that's also a limitation. The next point is that although a lot of AI principles talk about fairness and non-discrimination, and that's a well understood value, what fairness means actually differs as per the local context. And the scholars have, and I think I have some links at the bottom of the page, some research where scholars talk about the fact that much of the fairness discourse has been informed by Western notions of fairness and by Western tools of determining fairness. And if you take an example of this in the Indian context, so there is, of course, groundbreaking research like the gender shades work, which points to the intersectionality between gender and race, and how that can lead to flawed outcomes. But if you think about the lenses of discrimination and unfairness in India, it is much broader, and some of the issues may be more relevant than gender and race also, like questions around caste, questions around religious minorities, questions around regional disparities, and therefore issues of discrimination have to be situated in that local context. And so far, unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of empirical and applied research happening, and which points to the earlier issue about the lack of data sets, to enable some of that auditing and research happening. The next question I wanted to just jump into is around who decides. So all of these questions around, whose data, there are obviously big questions around the ownership of data, etc. But beyond that, whenever decisions are to be made about, what kind of AI is to be developed, the agenda setting part of it, there is very little participation from this broader public on whose data the whole framework is being premised. And similarly, when you think about even governance and the development of principles and thinking about the future of AI regulation, there is very little scope and avenue for participation in that process. And much of the debate that happens is, in the form of consultations that are largely taking place in English, which for a majority of the country is not the primary language. And therefore, just by virtue of, the language that is chosen for having these debates, a large part of the population is excluded. Also, people are excluded, that brings me to the last point on this slide, because of skill gap. So usually when we think about AI, the conversation is about technical skills and need for skilling and reskilling in that context. But even to have a conversation around ethics and principles of AI, you need a certain skill set and you need a certain base level to, identify those harms. So there could be groups which work extensively on gender rights and gender inclusion, but if they don't know enough about AI to correlate those harms in an AI context, we will miss those perspectives in a debate about AI governance. And that's, points to a larger question about who is responsible for this capacity building. Sure, each organization, each individual needs to inform themselves, but is there a broader mandate, whether it should come from the state, whether it should come from the private sector, about, translating some of these into actually, meaningful participation? And with that, I wanted to jump into the example. I'm not sure, how am I on the time, Caroline? Do you have a sense of how many minutes I have left?
You have about a minute and a half, somewhere there.
Oh, okay. I'll be super quick then. So, but this was some research that we did last year along with my co-author Gaurav Jain, and I won't go into the findings, etc. But basically, the premise of the paper, the point of the paper was we wanted to test how well and how do facial processing tools perform on Indian faces. And the barrier we met with there was that any of the available data sets were really not suitable for our purposes. They were either just looking at celebrities, or they were just focused on students, or they didn't have the rural population. So we went about creating a data set of our own based on publicly available data from the Election Commission of India, the candidates who stand for election. And we faced a lot of ethical dilemmas, and that made us realize that actually there is so much lack of consensus and understanding around, even people who want to apply ethical principles really don't have a framework on how to go about it. Or although the principles exist, it's very hard to translate that when you apply that to a problem. So one issue we faced, whoever we spoke to across disciplines, people had very different viewpoints on whether, you can just take publicly available data and it's completely fair game as long as data is in the public domain, or it varies about the context, because there's so much research talking about the context of publicly available data and saying, if it's social media data, it should be treated differently. If it's data like this of public figures, maybe it needs to be treated differently. And it, if there's time in the offline, the other sessions, I can talk a little bit more about the choices that we made, and they may not be the best or the ideal choices, but it's just to point out that there are these dilemmas that researchers have to deal with. And then if you translate that to people who are not bound by law in any way, because we don't have legal requirements around this. Companies, when they make these decisions, even the state, when it takes this decision, given how hard it is to apply some of these ethical principles, often it's a process that it's skipped, or shortcuts are found around it, because we haven't really found that interdisciplinary answer on how to view some of these questions of ethics in a practical context. So I'll stop with that. No time for the legal framework, and hopefully if there are questions, I'm happy to take them in the chat box. Thanks.
Thank you, Smriti. I know you have a lot to say, and it's a very interesting and complex situation, actually, that you're speaking to in India with the diversity in culture and language. So thank you for trying to summarize that all. And again, please ask questions on the side. I'm sure the breakout rooms are going to be very interesting.